I have thought a lot before deciding to tell you about one of the paranormal experiences I lived during my years of service as a Houston City police officer. Although it was not the only one, it was one of the toughest that I had to deal with. My name is Chris Dominguez, a retired officer of the Texas State Police Forces. There were many strange situations that I had to deal with in my years of service, but there was one that especially marked me, and today I am going to share it with you. It was a night like any other at the station. My colleague on duty that night was a Mexican woman named Maria. If you ask me if it bothered me to be accompanied by a woman, the answer is no. She was a very capable colleague and had more guts than many men. We were still at the station when the operator had to leave for a moment. When that phone began to ring, Maria, with her heart so big, covered the operator, pretending to be her. She wrote down the report and then told me to follow her. We had work to do. A girl made the report, she told me as I put the patrol car in gear. She says she is alone and that she is very hungry. We left the station. The night was dark and the air was heavy with humidity. We drove through silent streets, barely lit by the flashing lights of the headlights. The area we were headed to was not exactly one of the best known for being a troubled neighborhood with high crime rates. Upon arrival, the first thing I noticed was the unusual quietness of the place. There was no noise, not even that of the crickets, and a feeling of discomfort took over me. Maria turned off the engine, and we both got out of the vehicle. We headed to the house from which the call had been made, an old, poorly maintained structure with broken windows and the garden completely neglected. The front door was ajar, and a slight creaking sound resonated when we pushed it. Inside, the air was cold, much more than it should be on a summer night in Houston. The darkness was total, and we had to use our lin to light the way. The living room was empty. The furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if no one had lived there in years. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to stay calm and move on. "Hello, is someone here?" called Maria in a firm voice. There was no answer. We went deeper into the house. Each step we took seemed to echo more than normal, as if the echo spread in a much larger space than it really was. We came to a hallway, and at the end of it, we saw a half-open door from where came a slight murmur, as if someone was speaking in a low voice. We approached cautiously. When we opened the door, what I saw left me breathless. In the center of the room, there was a girl of no more than 7 or 8 years old, sitting on the floor. Her hair was disheveled, and her clothes were dirty and torn. The most disturbing thing was her look. Her eyes were empty, as if there was no life in them. "Hello, little one. Are you okay?" Maria asked, kneeling beside her. The girl did not answer. She just stayed there, staring into the void. I decided to approach and examine the room. The walls were covered with strange marks and symbols that I did not recognize. A chill ran through my body again. Suddenly, the girl spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but I heard her clearly. "I am hungry." Maria tried to calm her down, assuring her that we would help her, but something in me felt that there was more than we could see. I decided to explore the house a little more while Maria stayed with the girl. I walked through the hallways, dark, feeling that each step became harder and harder to breathe. As I came to another house, I found what looked like an improvised altar. There were black candles out and more strange symbols drawn on the floor and walls. A strong smell of sulfur filled the air. In the center of the altar, there was an old, faded photograph of a family. I recognized the girl in the photo, but what surprised me was that the photo seemed to be at least 50 years old. Suddenly, I heard a scream coming from the room where Maria was. I ran back. My heart was pounding as I entered. I saw Maria on the floor, unconscious, and the girl had disappeared. I felt a cold, oppressive presence around me, and a voice whispered in my ear, "She will never go away." I picked up Maria and ran out of the house, barely breathing from fear. When I reached the patrol car, I laid her down on the seat and called on the radio for backup. While we waited, I saw the lights in the house flickering, and I heard childish laughter coming from inside. I refused to go back in. Reinforcements arrived and took Maria to the hospital. When she regained consciousness, she didn't remember anything of what had happened after entering the room. We tried to investigate more about the house and the family in the photo, but we found nothing in the records. The house was abandoned again, and no one dared to approach. That experience left a mark on me. Sometimes, in my dreams, I see the girl looking at me with those empty eyes, and I feel that the presence of that house still follows me. I don't know what it was that we found that night, but I know it was not from this world. Since then, I have learned to respect the unknown and to understand that there are things that we cannot explain or understand. Reality sometimes surpasses fiction. As police, we face situations that defy our understanding and remind us that there is more in this world than we can see or understand. I am grateful to have had partners like Maria, but I also know that some experiences will stay with us forever, like shadows in the dark. My name is Tomas, and I am a Texas State police officer, specifically in the city of Houston. I have been on duty for 10 years, patrolling the streets and facing the worst that humanity can offer. However, what I experienced one night in March changed my life forever and made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. That night had been particularly rough. I had responded to a shooting in a dangerous neighborhood, arrested a couple of armed criminals, and solved a robbery case. I was physically and mentally exhausted. All I wanted was to get back to my apartment, take a hot shower, and sleep. When I got home, I left my car in the underground garage and walked to the elevator. The garage was almost empty, with only a few vehicles parked in scattered spots. The lighting was dim enough to see, but not bright enough to feel safe. As I walked down the hallway leading to the elevator, I noticed something strange. A small girl, barefoot and with her hair down, was walking slowly towards me. It seemed like she had a hard time moving. Each step was a struggle. It was not common to see a girl alone at that time of the morning, and even less so in a place like that. I approached her cautiously. "Why are you here at this hour? Where is your small house? Where are your parents?" I asked, hoping for some answer that would make sense. The girl just looked at me with big, dark eyes but didn't say anything. There was something in her gaze that worried me. A deep sadness, almost palpable. I decided to call 911 so someone would come look for her. While I spoke with the operator, I turned my gaze towards the girl, but she had vanished without a trace. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I looked around, looking for some sign of her, but there was nothing. It was as if the earth had swallowed her. I got into the elevator with a growing feeling of discomfort. When I reached my floor, the 5th, I opened the door of my apartment and let myself fall on the couch. I tried to get out of my head what had happened, attributing it to fatigue. I made myself a coffee and went to the shower. The hot water helped relax my muscles, but it could not take away my restlessness. I left the bathroom, put on a t-shirt and some shorts, and lay down on the bed. Sleep was not long in coming, but it was not restful. I dreamed of the girl, her dark eyes staring at me fixedly, her figure fading in the darkness of the garage. I woke up several times during the night, sweating and with my heart racing. The next morning, still disturbed by the encounter, I decided to investigate a little more and went to talk to the building's janitor, an older man named Frank who had been working there for over 20 years. If anyone knew anything about the little girl, it would be him. "Good morning, Frank. Can I ask you a question?" I told him when I found him in his office. "Of course, Thomas. What do you need?" He replied kindly. "Last night, I saw a little girl in the garage, alone and barefoot. I've never seen her before. Do you know anything about that?" Frank frowned thoughtfully. "I have no knowledge of any little girl living in this building, much less one walking around alone at that hour." "That sounds very strange." I told him in detail what I had seen, hoping he might offer some logical explanation. However, his expression only grew more worried. Many years ago, before this building was built, there was a house on this land. It is said that a family lived there and that a tragedy occurred. The little girl disappeared one night and was never found. Some say that her spirit still haunts this place. I felt a chill run down my spine. Hearing those words, I didn't believe in ghosts or horror stories, but what I had seen the night before could not be explained in a simple way, logically. I decided to investigate more about the history of the house and the disappearance of the girl. I spent the next few days looking for information in the local library and talking to the oldest residents of the neighborhood. I discovered that there was indeed a house on that location before the building was built. The family there was known for being reserved and mysterious. The disappearance of the girl was never solved, and over time, the story became an urban legend. As I delved deeper into the investigation, I began to notice strange things in my apartment. Objects that changed places, lights that flickered for no apparent reason, and a constant feeling of being watched. Every night, the dreams with the girl became more vivid and terrifying. In one of them, I saw her walking down the hallway of my building, her bare feet leaving bloody footprints on the floor. One night, while I was reviewing some documents about the family, I heard a noise in the living room. I came out of the bedroom and saw the girl standing by the window. This time, her expression was not one of sadness but of fear. I approached slowly, trying not to scare her. "What do you want from me?" I asked with a trembling voice. She raised a hand and pointed towards the apartment door without saying a word. She began to walk towards the hallway, and I followed her, feeling my heart pound strongly. We arrived at the garage, to the same place where I had seen her for the first time. There, in a dark corner, I saw something I had not noticed before. A small old door almost hidden by a pile of boxes. The girl stopped in front of the door and looked at me. I understood that she wanted me to open it. With trembling hands, I moved the boxes and pushed the door. What I found on the other side took my breath away. It was a small, dirty, abandoned room with remains of old toys and a broken bed on the floor. There was a diary covered in dust. I picked it up and began to read. It was the diary of the girl's mother, full of anguish and despair. It described how her daughter had begun to behave strangely, talking about an imaginary friend who would say horrible things to her. One night, the girl disappeared and was never found. The mother wrote about how she desperately searched for her daughter until the day of her own death. I felt a deep sadness and compassion for the family. The little girl was not an evil spirit, but a lost soul looking for help. I decided I had to do something to give her peace. I went back to the apartment and found the little girl waiting for me. I promised her that I would do everything in my power to make her spirit rest in peace. That night, I lit a candle and prayed for her, asking that she find the rest she deserved. Since then, I never saw the little girl again. Objects stopped moving, the lights stopped flickering, and my dreams became quiet. Yes, however, I will never forget that experience. It made me see the world differently, reminding me that there are things beyond our understanding and that some souls need our help to find peace. The story of the little girl and her family became a constant reminder of how fragile life is and how important it is to be there for others, even after death. Every time I pass by the garage, I think of her, and I hope that wherever she has finally found the peace she was looking for. Over time, I shared my experience with my coworkers and with the local community. Some were skeptical. Others believed me without hesitation, but they all agreed that the girl's story deserved to be known, not only as a warning of what could have been, but as a call for compassion and empathy. Now, every time I investigate a case, I try to remember what I learned from that experience. My name is Armando, and until recently, I was a proud police officer. But experiences mark you in such a way that they change your life forever. This is the story of a night that I will never forget. The night my life turned into an endless torment. That night, I was on duty on night patrol with my partner, Luis. Most of the time, our job consisted of handling routine calls, domestic fights, annoying noises, the occasional arrest for drunk driving. But that night, the call we received was different. So different that I still don't know if it really happened or if it was all a cruel illusion. It all started at 2:43 in the morning. The patrol car radio crackled, and the dispatcher's voice informed us of an emergency call. The address was an old house on the outskirts of town, a place we didn't even know existed. The dispatcher told us the call was from a man named Esteban Garcia, who claimed to be trapped in his own home by something unexplainable. "This is going to be interesting," said Luis with a tired smile as he drove through the dark streets. I nodded without saying a word, feeling a strange uneasiness that I couldn't explain. As we approached the address, the city was turning into a desert of empty streets and abandoned buildings. Finally, we arrived at a house that seemed to be taken from another time. It was a decrepit structure of dark wood with broken windows and an unkempt garden that looked like it hadn't seen life in decades. We turned off the lights of the patrol car and approached the house. The front door was ajar, and when we pushed it, it made a long and creepy squeak. We entered with the lanterns held high, illuminating the dusty hallway. "Mr. Garcia?" I called out. "We're here." There was no answer, only an oppressive silence that echoed off the empty walls. We continued moving forward, exploring room by room. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and spider webs, as if no one had lived there in years. But then we found something that left us perplexed. In one of the rooms on the second floor, there was a table with unlit candles and a series of strange symbols drawn on the floor. In the center of those symbols was an old rotary telephone. Luis and I exchanged glances, not knowing what to think. It was then that the phone rang, breaking the silence with its metallic bell. We stood paralyzed, unable to move. Finally, Luis took the phone and answered. "Hello?" he said in a trembling voice. I couldn't hear the answer, but the expression of terror on his face told me it was nothing good. He hung up the phone abruptly and looked at me. "He's in the basement," he whispered. We descended the stairs to the basement with a growing feeling of dread. The stairs creaked under our weight, and the air grew colder and denser as we went down. When we got to the bottom, our flashlights revealed a nightmare scene. Esteban Garcia was there, but he was no ordinary man. He was chained to the wall, his body covered in scars and bruises. His eyes were bulging, filled with an indescribable terror. I tried to talk to him, to understand what had happened, but the only thing that came out of his mouth were incoherent words and whispers about the curse. Luis and I tried to free him, but the chains were impregnable. It was then that we heard the noise. It was a whisper, like the wind passing through a crack, but it didn't come from anywhere. It seemed to fill the entire space, growing in intensity until it became a deafening scream. Suddenly, the lights of our flashlights began to flicker and go out. Darkness enveloped us, and I felt a freezing cold that penetrated to my bones. "Luis!" I screamed, and I felt something dragging him. I tried to grab it, but my hands only found air. His scream faded, leaving behind a deadly silence. I turned on my flashlight again and found myself alone in the basement. Esteban had disappeared, and panic also invaded me. I ran up the stairs, stumbling and falling several times in my hurry to get out of that house. Once outside, I found myself in the patrol car with no memory of how I had gotten there. The clock on the dashboard read 4:15 in the morning. I tried to contact the station, but the radio was dead. I started the engine and drove back to the city as fast as I could. When I got to the station, I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. The house I described did not exist in any records. My superiors assumed I had suffered some kind of mental breakdown and gave me an indefinite medical leave. I don't know what was real and what wasn't from that night. All I know is that since then, I have been haunted by nightmares every night. I dream of that house, with Esteban and Luis, and with that whispering voice that promises eternal torment. I have become a shadow of what I was, living in constant fear that one day the darkness will claim me again. I remember that night like it was yesterday. I was on patrol with my partner, Francisco, through a central area of the city. It was a normal night, nothing out of the ordinary apart from those 2 individuals for speeding and 3 others for disturbing the peace. But little did we know, that was just a warm-up for how busy the night would be. Francisco, my partner, received the call from the operator to report a complaint from a woman who said that thieves had broken into her house. "Okay, operator, let's go right away." My partner put down the radio while he told me what direction I should take at the next intersection. "Turn left and take the south roundabout. The complaint is at jumbo number 124, so we did. We went through the streets with the speed required by a complaint of someone who is in danger and totally silent so as not to attract attention. We stopped in front of the house that remained in darkness, and then we entered, revolvers in hand, attentive to everything. I remember that we made a tour around the house looking for some clue that would allow us to intervene. Then, in the back, we found the door belonging to the kitchen half open. I pushed it very slowly and we entered. It was necessary to take out the flashlight to light ourselves because everything was very dark. But we were able to make sure that in that place, there was no woman and much less thieves, only filth and neglect. We were in trouble and we were aware of it. Perhaps someone made the complaint with the aim of settling accounts with us, so we had to be very attentive. We must not forget that in our profession, enemies rain down, but we were far from suspecting what all that was about. "Better let's go, Francisco," I said to my partner, who nodded. Then we began to back up in search of the door where we entered. We almost arrived, but when we got to it, the door, as if coming to life, closed very abruptly. We stood staring at the closed door, stunned. There was no wind or a draft that could have closed it. The silence of the house was deep and oppressive, and the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own around us. Francesco and I exchanged a look, and at that moment, I knew that he also felt the same uneasiness as me. Something was terribly wrong. I tried to open the door, but it was not known. It was closed tightly, as if someone had closed it from the other side. I banged on it with the butt of my revolver, screaming for whoever might be on the other side to open it. But there was no answer, only the echo of my own voices ringing through the emptiness of the house. We decided to look for another way out. We moved cautiously, flashlights in hand, through the kitchen. The shadows danced on the walls as we went, and every creak of the floor beneath our feet seemed amplified in the silence. We reached the living room, a large gloomy room with furniture covered in dust and cobwebs hanging from the corners. It looked like no one had lived there in years. The uneasiness turned into a palpable feeling of threat. My mind tried to rationalize what we were experiencing, but every logical explanation faded before the reality of our situation. The house seemed alive, and we were intruders in its dark domain. As we crossed the living room, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, focusing the flashlight, but I saw nothing. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Francisco. He nodded, his face tense. We were not alone in the house. Whatever that was with us was not human. We decided to check the upper floor, hoping to find a window or balcony from which we could call for help or escape. We climbed the stairs, each footstep echoing on the old wood. We came to a long hallway with several doors on either side. We tried the first one to be a bathroom. The second was an empty bedroom with a dirty mattress on the floor and bare walls. The third, a sort of study with empty shelves and a desk covered in dust. Opening the fourth door, we entered a room that appeared to be the master bedroom. There was a large bed covered with a threadbare duvet and a tall wardrobe in one corner. The window was closed and secured with old nails. Francisco approached the window, trying to force it open, while I searched the wardrobe. Opening the wardrobe doors, I came across something that made my blood run cold. Inside the wardrobe hung an antique dress stained with what appeared to be dried blood. On the floor of the wardrobe was a broken porcelain doll with a malevolent expression on its face. Painted around the doll's neck, there was a rope tied in a curly knot. Something about that scene filled me with irrational terror. "Francisco, look at this," I called, my voice shaking. He turned and saw the contents of the closet. His expression darkened. "We have to get out of here now," he said. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut, leaving us trapped. We tried to open it, but it was locked again, like the kitchen door. The air in the room grew colder, and I could see my breath forming in little clouds in front of me. Then we heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "They shouldn't be here." The words were barely perceptible, but loaded with an implicit threat. I felt a chill run down my spine. The room began to darken even more, and Francisco's flashlight flickered before going out completely. Only the dim light of my flashlight remained, which seemed to be absorbed by the increasingly dense shadows. The whisper continued, now accompanied by a faint sound of footsteps approaching. Suddenly, something pushed us with an invisible force. We fell to the ground, struggling to get up. I felt a pressure on my chest, as if something was sitting on me, making it difficult for me to breathe. I saw the same desperation in Francisco's eyes as he too tried to break free. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the pressure suddenly disappeared. We stood up, gasping for air, and I saw that the bedroom door was now open. Without a second thought, we ran towards it and went down the stairs as fast as we could. When we reached the ground floor, we found the kitchen door open again. We ran out of the house without stopping to look back. When we got to our patrol car, I turned around to look at the house one last time. The lights were on now, and in one of the second-floor windows, I saw the silhouette of a woman looking at us. I couldn't make out her features, but I knew she was watching us. We got in the car and drove away at full speed. We didn't speak during the ride back to the police station. We both knew that what we had experienced had no rational explanation. That house was something dark, and something dark lived in it. When we got to the police station, we reported what had happened, although we omitted the more supernatural details. We said that we didn't find anyone in the house and that it seemed abandoned. The superiors seemed to accept our version, although with some skepticism. That night, when I got home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of the woman in the window. Her presence had been engraved in my mind, and fear continued to haunt me. Days and weeks went by, and the memory of that night didn't fade. Francisco and I never talked about what happened, as if by not mentioning it, we could make it disappear. However, we both knew the truth. Something dark and evil lived in that house, and we had had the bad luck to come across it. It was past midnight when my partner and I received a call about strange lights in the local cemetery. It was a quiet night with a clear sky, and the full moon bathed the city with its pale light. We accepted the call without thinking much about it. The nights were usually boring, and anything that broke the monotony was welcome. We drove in silence to the cemetery, a place that had a gloomy reputation among the residents. There were stories of apparitions, unexplained noises, and shadows moving among the graves. Many considered these stories to be simple superstitions, but the cold night air and the mist that was beginning to form gave the place an eerie atmosphere. Upon arrival, we parked the patrol car near the main entrance. The rusty and creaking wrought iron gates were ajar. We turned on our flashlights and entered the grounds, feeling the crunch of dry leaves under our boots. The cemetery was silent, too silent. Not a single sound of insects or nocturnal birds broke the stillness. We walked among the tombstones, observing the elongated shadows cast by our flashlights. We saw nothing out of the ordinary at first, just the tombs and mausoleums covered in moss. But then a flash of light captured our attention, coming from an older section of the cemetery where the oldest and most neglected graves were. We headed towards the source of the light, feeling the temperature drop as we moved forward. The mist thickened, making it difficult to see. We finally reached a small clearing surrounded by ancient tombstones and worn statues. In the center, we saw what appeared to be an ethereal figure, a human form shrouded in a whitish light. I feared the figure. It didn't seem to have any defined features, just a spectral presence that floated over a particular grave. We stood paralyzed for a moment, unable to process what we were seeing. The figure began to move slowly, as if it were floating towards us. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt my hands begin to shake. Without thinking, we took a step back. The figure stopped and then vanished into the mist as if it had never been there. We felt temporary relief, but as we approached the grave it had been floating over, we noticed something strange. The tombstone was broken, and the earth seemed to have been recently disturbed. Something had been unearthed. The air around the grave felt colder, almost freezing. We looked at each other, trying to understand what could have caused such a phenomenon. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. We realized that we were not alone. Suddenly, a sharp and heartbreaking scream broke the silence. It came from somewhere nearby, a scream of anguish and despair that froze our blood. We turned in the direction of the sound and began to run, our flashlights trembling as they illuminated the way. Every shadow seemed to come to life, and fear took hold of us. When we reached the source of the scream, we found a woman kneeling next to a grave. Her clothes were torn, and her hair was disheveled. As we approached, she looked up and looked at us with eyes full of terror. There were no signs of physical injuries, but her expression reflected a deep and indescribable panic. We helped her to her feet and tried to calm her down. She could not articulate coherent words. She only babbled about them and the darkness. We realized that she needed medical help and quickly took her to the patrol car. As we moved away from the cemetery, the atmosphere seemed to grow even more oppressive, as if something invisible was following us around the hospital. The doctors informed us that the woman had entered a state of shock. They were unable to get much information from her, only fragments of sentences that made no sense. We decided to investigate further. The next day, upon returning to the cemetery during the day, everything seemed normal. The sunlight abated any sense of fear, and the cemetery workers reported nothing unusual. However, upon examining the grave where we had seen the spectral figure, we discovered something disturbing. The grave belonged to a young woman who had died tragically many years ago. Her story was well known in the community. It was said that she had been a victim of a violent crime, and that her spirit had not found rest. That night, as we went through records and spoke to residents, more details came to light. The woman we met was a distant relative of the young woman buried in that grave. She had been investigating the death of her relative, convinced that something more sinister was behind her murder. The police at the time had not found enough evidence, and the case had been filed away. The next few days were filled with strange events. We began to receive reports of lights in the cemetery almost every night. Whenever we went, the spectral figure would appear briefly before disappearing into the mist. The feeling of being watched never left us. We decided to set up an undercover surveillance one night, hoping to capture any unusual activity. We hid among the tombstones, waiting in silence. Several hours passed without incident until we finally saw the light. The spectral figure appeared again, floating over the same grave. This time, we were prepared with cameras and recorders. We tried to document what was happening. The figure began to move again, and the temperature dropped abruptly. We felt a pressure in our chest, as if the air had become thick and heavy. Our flashlights flickered and then went out, leaving us in the dark with only the light of the moon to guide us. An icy wind blew through the cemetery, carrying with it whispers and moans. The figure slowly approached, and we were able to see its face for the first time. It had no human features, just a dark, empty shadow. A whispering voice filled the air, begging for justice and crying out for vengeance. The tape recorder in my hand captured every word, every sound, but when we reviewed the tapes the next day, everything was blank. There was no evidence of what we had witnessed. We realized we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. We decided to seek help from an expert in the paranormal, a local investigator known for his work in similar cases. He agreed to help us, and together we returned to the cemetery one more night, equipped with more sophisticated equipment and a renewed determination. Upon arrival, the investigator asked us to stay close while he performed a ritual to communicate with the spirit. He lit candles and began reciting words in an ancient language. The figure appeared once again, but this time it did not fade away. It just stood watching us with its empty eyes. The investigator spoke directly to it, asking it to reveal what it wanted. The figure came even closer, and the temperature dropped to unbearable levels. The air was filled with a sulfurous stench, and a feeling of oppression surrounded us. The whispering voice became clearer, and we could understand her words. It was the voice of a young woman asking for justice for her unjust death. We realized that we had to solve the crime so that the spirit could find peace. With the help of the investigator, we reviewed the old case with new eyes. We discovered details that had passed us by, a clue that led us to a man who had been suspected but never charged. We decided to confront him, and under pressure, he confessed to his crime. He was arrested and brought to trial, and the case was finally solved. The night of his conviction, we returned to the cemetery one last time. The figure appeared, but this time there was no coldness or oppression. The light that surrounded her was brighter, warmer. The young woman looked at us and nodded before disappearing forever. The cemetery was silent, but this time it was a silence of peace. That experience changed our lives forever. We learned that some souls do not rest until they find justice, and we, as patrolmen, have the duty to protect both the living and the dead. The night shift is not for everyone. The streets are empty, the shadows seem longer, and the noises louder. For patrolmen, the night becomes a canvas of uncertainties and dangers. But nothing we had experienced before compared to that night on the bridge. It was a night without a moon, and the wind blew with an unusual force, making the trees whisper ancient secrets. My partner and I were walking our usual route when an emergency call diverted us to a bridge on the outskirts of the city. The presence of a hooded figure was reported, apparently about to jump. When we arrived, we parked the patrol car and approached cautiously. The figure, wrapped in a black cape, was swinging dangerously on the edge of the bridge, seemingly oblivious to our presence. We called out to him, and he turned slowly. What we saw froze our blood. A pale, decomposed, cadaverous face stared at us with empty, dark eyes. The figure jumped into the void before we could react. We ran to the edge of the bridge and looked down, hoping to see the impact on the water, but there was none. Nobody, just the black water and a freezing sensation that enveloped us. The cold crept into our bones, and a deathly silence surrounded us. The patrol radio crackled, interrupting the stillness. A confused voice asked if everything was in order. My partner answered yes, but we both knew that something strange had happened. We returned to the patrol and decided to inspect the surroundings of the bridge. The lanterns barely broke the darkness, and each step resonated with a disturbing echo. We walked along the riverbank, looking for any trace of the hooded figure, but we found nothing. Only that freezing sensation persisted, as if something was still watching us. We decided to record the incident as a false alarm, but in our hearts we knew that it had been more than that. The image of that cadaverous face was engraved in our minds, and the uneasiness accompanied us for the rest of the night. With the dawn, we returned to the station and shared our experience with other companions. Some laughed, suggesting that tiredness had played a trick on us. But an old sergeant took us aside with a serious face. He told us about the legend of the bridge. Many years ago, a tragedy had taken place there. A desperate woman, after losing her family in an accident, had thrown herself from the bridge. Since then, her restless spirit wandered the area. Many had reported seeing her hooded figure, but no one had managed to explain her sudden disappearance. That night, my partner and I decided to return to the bridge, this time with the intention of finding answers. We were determined to unravel the mystery, carrying recording equipment, cameras, and more powerful flashlights. We wanted to document any evidence that could explain what we had seen. The darkness once again enveloped us, and the wind blew again with that supernatural force. When we reached the bridge, the icy sensation enveloped us again. We began to explore meticulously, illuminating every corner with our flashlights. Suddenly, the recording equipment captured a weak sound, like a whisper. We adjusted the frequency, and we could hear a faint voice, almost inaudible, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The words were confusing, but the desperation in the tone was clear. Then the hooded figure appeared again, this time in the center of the bridge. The camera captured it clearly, and its cadaverous face stared at us once more. But this time it didn't jump into the void. It stayed there, looking at us as if it expected something from us. My partner and I looked at each other, and in silence, we knew what we had to do. Slowly, we approached the figure. Our hands were trembling slightly. Being a few steps away, we felt a current of icy air that enveloped us. The figure began to speak, its voice resonating in our minds more than in the air. It told us its story of pain and loss, how it searched for its family in the darkness, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. Its soul could not find peace, and every night, it repeated its voices into the void, waiting for an end that never came. We could not offer the redemption it sought, but we promised to tell its story, keep its memory alive, and find a way to help it find peace. The figure looked at us with gratitude and slowly began to fade, leaving only the cold breeze as a witness to its presence. We returned to the patrol, knowing that we had lived something that many would not believe. But we had the recording as proof, and that gave us some peace of mind. At the station, we reviewed the material and found not only the image of the figure, but also its clear and desperate voice telling its tragic story. Since that night, the bridge stopped being just a structure over the river. It became a place of respect and memory. Every time we passed by there, we felt the presence of the hooded figure, now less desperate, knowing that its story had not been lost in time. The night shifts continued to be dangerous and full of uncertainties, but after that experience, we carried with us a deeper understanding of what lurks in the darkness. Not only criminals and physical dangers, but also lost souls and pains that transcend death. The story of the hooded figure became a legend at the station. Some colleagues made fun of us, but others looked at us with a mixture of respect and fear. They knew that what we had seen and heard was not a simple hallucination. Every time someone new joined the night shift, we shared our experience, not to scare them but to prepare them, because in the darkness, not only the living lurk, but also the dead, and being prepared for the unexpected is part of the duty of a night patrolman. And so, life went on, with nights filled with dangers, mysteries, and occasional encounters with the inexplicable. But we always remember that night on the bridge, a night that changed our perception of reality and reminded us that even in the toughest profession, there are moments that defy all logic and reason. I am a police officer in a city in the north of the country. I work the night shift, a schedule that many avoid due to the strange and disturbing incidents that occur in the dark. For years, I have seen everything from common crimes to situations that defy logic. However, nothing prepared me for what I experienced in the shopping plaza one autumn night. That night, we received an emergency call from the plaza. The report was vague. Strange noises, figures moving in the shadows, and a general feeling of unease that had alerted the security team. Upon arrival, the plaza was deserted, their hallways lit only by emergency lights. It was a modern place, but the atmosphere that night had an air of abandonment, as if time had decided to pause. I met the head of security at the main entrance. His face showed a mix of tiredness and fear. He led me to the security office where we reviewed the surveillance cameras. The recordings showed shadows moving erratically through the hallways, and at one point, a small figure that seemed to be a child appeared in front of a closed store, trying to enter. What made my skin crawl was the appearance of something else behind the child, something that had no human form. I decided to investigate further, starting with the store where my friend had recently made repairs. The lights flickered, and the environment was impregnated with an inexplicable cold. I felt that something was watching me, a presence that seemed to lurk from the shadows. As I walked through the deserted hallways, the silence was deafening. Suddenly, a metallic noise broke the stillness. I headed towards the source of the sound, and what I saw left me frozen. The figure of the child was standing in front of a store, staring at the closed door. I approached slowly, trying not to scare him, but when I was a few meters away, the boy turned to me. His eyes were two empty, lifeless wells. I stepped back, and at that moment, the shadow I had seen on the cameras appeared behind him. It was a tall, thin entity with elongated limbs and a face that faded into the darkness. I tried to communicate by radio with the head of security, but static was the only thing I heard. The boy and the shadow began to move towards me, and I felt panic take over my body. I ran towards the exit, but each step seemed heavier than the last, as if something invisible was slowing me down. I managed to get out of the store and headed back to the security office. The chief was pale, looking at the screens with wide eyes. He told me there was something else I needed to know. Years ago, a fire devastated a part of the plaza before it was remodeled. According to rumors, a child had died in that fire, trapped inside a store. No one knew how the fire had started, but since then, the night watchman spoke of apparitions and unexplained noises. I decided we should end this night of horror. I returned to the store, armed with a flashlight and my gun. The place was darker than before, and the air felt thick. When I entered, I saw the boy again, but this time he was not alone. The tall figure was behind him and seemed more defined, more real. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it towards them. The boy raised a hand, as if asking for help. I felt a wave of compassion and fear at the same time. I took a step forward, and the shadow moved, launching itself towards me with an inhuman speed. The air turned cold, and I felt a pressure on my chest that made me fall to my knees. At that moment, I heard a weak voice, almost a whisper, coming from the boy. "Help me," he said, and his face showed an expression of anguish that broke my heart. The shadow stopped, as if it was waiting for my reaction. I said a quick prayer and fired towards the shadow. The shot echoed in the store but had no effect. The entity faded away, leaving alone the boy, who now seemed more human, more real. I approached and extended my hand. The boy took it, and I felt a warmth that contrasted with the cold that had been there before. The boy smiled, and with a sparkle in his eyes, disappeared. The atmosphere in the store changed immediately. The cold vanished, and the lights stopped flickering. I left the store exhausted but relieved. The head of security was waiting for me, and I told him what happened. We decided to keep this a secret so as not to alarm people and to protect the employees. That night changed my life. Since then, I have investigated more paranormal cases and have learned that there are things in this world that defy our understanding. The mall continues to operate, and few know what really happened that night. But I will never forget the look of the boy and the shadow that tried to catch him. Years have passed since that night, but I am still haunted by the images of that boy and the shadow. Sometimes, in my night rounds, I feel like something is following me, a presence that has never completely gone away. I have learned to live with it, but I am always alert, waiting for the unexpected. Because in the darkness of the night, you never know what horrors may lurk, waiting for their moment to emerge again. If you like the stories, we would like you to support us with a like or a comment, as that would help us a lot. If you are not subscribed, we invite you to do so you do not miss the best of possessed stories of the night. Thank you for listening to us until the next story.